We'll just start, in fact, with David, because he'll be doing his presentation after the Minister speaks. By way of introduction, I'd just like to pick up on something that was said at the end of the showing of Annalisa's movie last night, which was that not all of the disasters that were foreshadowed took place. Looking at it with the benefit of 8 years of hindsight, you can see that Ukraine's search for democracy in Europe ended in tragedy, at least for the moment, but could become a triumph. The populist wave that was unleashed is still running. I couldn't help but notice that the figure for 2014 for the combined votes of right-wing, populist, Eurosceptical, anti-immigrant parties was 27%. That figure today is almost 40%. But there is good reason to believe that perhaps the peak of that wave has now passed. In the meantime, the EU has lost a huge chunk to become a smaller and arguably less globally important unit with the loss of the United Kingdom. But there is an argument for saying that the EU has become more cohesive as a result of that. The euro did not break up, as some feared, in 2014. And indeed, the reaction to the pandemic was exemplary. The launch of the new generation next generation EU project, which is the subject of this session. Is it going to be, as Germany's finance minister said the other day in an interview with the Financial Times, a one-off? Or is it going to be the foundation of something much bigger and bolder for the European Union in the future? And if it is, then how is that going to mesh with the existing rules? Do we now need to abolish the Stability and Growth Pact? Or do we need to modify it? Or do we need to replace it with something else? Well, all of that is going to be the subject of our discussion today. But with no more ado, I'd like to pass the word over to the Minister, Minister Enrico Giovannini.
I think he just logged off for a second.
Perhaps. Have we got the Minister there? Can he hear us?
Yes, I'm back, sorry.
All right, excellent. Okay, now let me give the floor to you, Minister, to introduce our session.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be invited to this conference, a very successful conference, I think.
So successful that the sound has disappeared.
It reinforces our call for digital infrastructure, I guess. Digital infrastructure in rural areas.
Yes. The infrastructure proved rather less sustainable than we had hoped.
Should I try to go first while we are trying to establish?
I'm just going to ask our technical.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what's going on, but I was just speaking. Sorry.
We are right at the start, I'm afraid, Minister.
Okay, I know. It looks like I have a problem with the line. I'm using the telephone as a hotspot. Is it working?
It is now, yes.
Okay, sorry. I was just congratulating the organizers of this successful conference, and Francesco Grillo, first of all, but Vision as a whole, for bringing together so many experts and also young people. And it's important to have a new approach to some of the challenges we have ahead of us, especially for making the European Union stronger. But as the paper that I would like to invite you to reread 2 years later, Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel wrote in March 2020, just after the start of the pandemic, that was entitled For Europe Fairer, More Sustainable and More Resilient. Fairness, sustainability, and the resilience dimension have become, in some sense, have become the mantra of the European policies over the last 2 years. But I would like just to start from a personal note. After stepping down as Minister of Labor in 2014, I was invited by the President Juncker's cabinet to join the think tank that was supporting the European Political Strategy Center. You see David just noting that. And after 2 years, I was told by the head of the center that the president, the head of the cabinet of the president, after a conference that I organized in Brussels, said that I should stop talking about sustainable development and resilience, because the European Commission would have never taken this perspective for its policies. Well, after a few years, I would say the story was quite different, thanks to the 2-0, yes. But if we go back to the reason by which the head of the cabinet was arguing that, he said that there was no way to tell people that the future would be full of shocks. That was the political argument that he was using to say that politicians could not tell people that the future would have been full of shocks, energy, environmental, medical, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, our last 2 years demonstrated that that vision was wrong. But the good news is that if you go back to the, I think was April 2020 Council's recommendations, the minutes of the European Council meeting, you will understand towards the end 10 lines that, in my view, are very relevant for today's discussion. Because the European Commission was charged by the Council of a new task to think about European institutions could react to frequent shocks. That was exactly the idea that was refused in 2016, because we have to recognize that the framework of the European Union institutions, beside the monetary policy, was not designed to face shocks. It was designed, think about how the Commission works, to elaborate a convergence of legislations, best practices, standards, but not really to react to shocks. And in fact, as it was said before, several people thought that the European Union could collapse in face of a shock like the pandemic. And again, later, with the start of the war and now the energy shock, people are still saying, well, the European Union as it is cannot work like this. Beside the political stories, we have to recognize that even the federal level at the United States that we mentioned several times was built just deciding over time to react at federal level to shocks instead of just leaving to states the responsibility of facing them. Just going back to the Great Depression story, it was decided to create what we could say a sure model. So it's something with benefits for people affected by unemployment. It was decided to add a layer at the federal level to what the single states were doing. So unfortunately, peaceful unions, let's say, build their federal level, deciding to respond at that level to a series of shocks. And this is what's happening also in the European Union. But, as I said, we can, just going back to several documents written over the last 2 years, for example, the Strategic Foresight Report by Vice President Šefčovič, where the idea of resilience was finally used and put at the core of the response at the point that we have to say National Plan of Recovery and Resilience, well, demonstrates that there is now consciousness about the need to respond quickly in a federal way, let's say, in a united way to shocks. After leaving the European Political Strategy Center, after what I mentioned before, I started working with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, where we elaborated exactly this framework for resilience as a model for policies. And we proposed to reallocate economic, social, environmental policies to a different framework. Policies that prepare to shocks, policies that prevent shocks, policies that protect people, policies that promote the resilience, and finally, policies that transform our system. Because making our economies and societies and environment resilient to shocks is not just an issue of single policies, but is an issue of transforming the entire system, including the institutional system, to make it fit for reacting to shocks. And we introduced the concept of transformative resilience, which means that we shouldn't react to shocks just hoping to go back where we were before the shock, unless we were on an optimal condition, which unfortunately is not the case. So we have to use shocks to make a jump ahead, a rebound towards a new equilibrium. In this perspective, I think that the discussion on a permanent fiscal space for the European Union is absolutely key. But a fiscal space to do what? Let me go back to the 4P plus 1T: protect, promote, prepare, prevent, transform. I think that, as SURE did, this a kind of European instrument to help to protect is fundamental. But second point, we can make reforms in order to promote the resilience of our systems, in order to prepare to shocks. And this is where the federal level is so important, because as we see, symmetric shocks may have very asymmetric impacts on the different countries. But the most important one is the transformational nature of this kind of common fiscal space. Like for the next generation, this money has to be spent for investments, but not only physical investments, not only immaterial investments like the digital one, but especially investment in people and in societies. Unfortunately, the system of national accounts do not consider investments in human capital and in social capital part of investments. Only the investments on physical stuff, infrastructures and so on, or digital ones, or intellectual property and so on, they are computed as investments in our system of national accounts, while training and social protection, which is very important for social sustainability, are recorded as current expenditure. This means that we have to change our accounting systems, and having changed that, and it's not rocket science, then we can decide common rules at European level on how to spend that money. Let me just conclude with two elements. It's true that we are trying to react to shocks in a sequential way. Health shock, pandemic, then the war, and now we are talking about common defense policy, and then we are talking about energy policy and so on, which is natural, having said what I said before, also looking at the United States history. But on the other hand, it's very important to find a moment, to find time to do what the strategic foresight report by European Commission said, which means that we have to sit down and think about future shocks in order not to run behind them. And let me say that I spent the first 3 days of this week in Davos at the World Economic Forum, attending several sessions, closed or open sessions. And it's quite clear, but I was convinced, I'm convinced since many years ago when I participated in this kind of international meetings, that European Union and the individual countries have to invest much more in the foresight capacity, which doesn't mean that you will be able to forecast exactly what will happen. But if you look at the way in which the Singapore government works, Abu Dhabi or United Emirates and so on work, but several countries also, including some OECD countries, work in terms of creating a sort of institute for future studies to prepare ourselves to anticipate and even drive, in some cases, policies to avoid future shocks. Well, this kind of investment is absolutely needed. And again, the institutional setup that we have at European level with the Joint Research Center, other services of the Commission could be better designed and integrated with national policies in order to allow the European Union as a whole to become more resilient, more sustainable, and more equitable, which is at the end what the treaty says about the final objectives of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. I'm now going to give the floor to over to David Rinaldi, who is the Director of Studies and Policy at the Foundation of Europe for European Progressive Studies, for a kind of framing of our discussion. David, over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Minister Giovannini. Let me speak closer to the microphone. After this nice speech by Minister Giovannini, and after having listened for 3 days to nice speeches from here, you feel the pressure of keeping you entertained. I'll try to be brief and hopefully interesting as well. And I'm happy to see actually that there are very close lines of thought with what Minister Giovannini shared. Because if I can allow myself to summarize what he just told us in some keywords, they are very similar to what I also wanted to tell you in introducing this session. First keyword, resilience. Second keyword to summarize Giovannini's intervention, sustainable development. Third keyword, federal firepower. And fourth, shocks. These are four important things that we need to consider once looking at the future of the European public finances, at creating a fiscal capacity for Europe. The first one, the federal level, is not that, of course, we have to, mimic the US. We will not get there. We are completely different. But this is just to give you a measure of the difference that is currently there. We have been discussing about Europe acting as a global superpower, and we just don't have the toolkit to do it yet. The US is spending a little less than Europe in terms of spending as a percentage of GDP, but a little less, 45 against 50%, more or less here in Europe. But the difference is that the federal level, if we can call it as such in Europe, is contributing to 2-3% of this public investment. So the public investment in Europe comes still from member states, regional level. At the US is 50% of the total public investment led, decided, allocated, and strategized by the federal level. And that is the, if you want, global power that you can have. If Europe is serious about driving the transitions, about becoming a global player, there's no way that we can do that without reforming the public finances of the European Union. So, in order to take on the opportunities, we need a proper budget. And the other point mentioned by Minister Giovannini on shocks. You have here a list of shocks and crises. When the Stability and Growth Pact was designed, it was designed in a moment of relatively economic stability and growth. It was meant to sustain growth over time, and it could have done so till the moment we encountered recessions and crises that now we know they are an essential part, an unavoidable part. And we don't know what will be the next. I put a bullet point on cybersecurity that is already happening there, but I don't know what's coming next. And there are so many of these shocks that, for me, have proved more than the resilience of the society. I would like to stress the resilience of the European Union as such. Confronted with many shocks, European Union has built up specific tools. You find in this weird house in the slides many policies launched by the European Union to offset and to take account of the different shocks and crises. There's also the Repower EU, the last one there, but there's FC, the facility for Turkey for the migration crisis. Even the ESM is still not yet in the community framework. It's still an intergovernmental body. So what I want to say is that the resilience of the EU has prompted about the creation of new solutions to ongoing problems. But all these solutions have not been somehow stabilized in a real community setting, in an architecture that works. Europe has been resilient, but as Jacques Delors was saying, now we don't need, this is no longer the time of firemen, we need architects. So we need to give stability to this house that is a patch of different policies, and perhaps we need to update what was the rule, the framework that was brought up at the beginning of the 90s. it's no wonder that the next generation EU brought some novelty. And it has been in economic policy a big dramatic change. Here I try to summarize what from my viewpoint are the two big changes that perhaps we need to crystallize in a more durable and long-term deal. First big change, there is a bulb, the beginning of a European fiscal capacity because of the joint debt at the federal level. There is a embryonal joint borrowing. But the other part that for me is intellectually very, very relevant and not yet enshrined in the rules is the beginning of a change in paradigm. The Stability and Growth Pact itself, by prioritizing on macro-financial stability, is basically telling that the role of the state is that of securing the stability of public finances, which is a prominent and important role. Nobody is discussing that. So rules and stability of public finances, yes. But we have now plenty of demands from left and right about the need of an active public sector shaping the society with equality, sustainability, regional justice, digital infrastructure. There is a complete new legitimacy for public intervention. And perhaps the rules now should reflect this need for investment, a change of paradigm in which the rules allow the public budgets at national and European level to shape the society and not only to calm the markets so that the market can invest where it matters. As Minister Giovannini said, and he had some P's and one T here, I use a little bit more the language of the European Commission. But at the moment, the rules are meant for a specific objective, that is that of macro-financial stability. And I think with all the changes that have been affecting our society, it is worth considering why are we cooperating at the European level, why economic coordination, why economic integration. At the very minimum, we should expand the issue of stability, not only for the macro-financial one, but also political and socio-economic stability, which is relevant for all European. But probably we need a pact that is not only for stability and growth, but is maybe for stability and sustainable development. Or I work for a progressive foundation for employment as well, perhaps stability, employment, and sustainable development pact. Ideally, what we want, and that's the objective of cooperating together, is well-being and prosperity. But the more we go through that axis, the better. But I wanted to ask, and perhaps this is a question to the speakers that will inspire the debate after me. What do you think it would be needed, and what do you think actually that will be the road taken by the European Union? My feeling is that probably we will not be able to enshrine a new paradigm in new rules. So we will not go through a new stability and sustainable development pact, which would be probably needed also to pack the different programs done so far into a new architecture. We can do some changes at the margin in the protocol of the Stability and Growth Pact, in the protocol of the fiscal compact, but most likely the European Union is likely to go on with introducing additional flexibility, which is the other side of the resilience of the European Union institution. So additional ad hoc measures instead of a complete rethinking and maybe a new treaty. So more. And I conclude with this, three options that are largely based on a contribution done by Marco Buti in one of the meetings at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. So I borrowed some of his thoughts. It means that we are in the realm of feasibility if the head of the cabinet of Commissioner Gentiloni is mentioning these possibilities. One could be making the recovery and resilience facility or something like that permanent. They told me not to call it Next Generation EU 2.0 because that's a no-go. So we have to find another name. And if you have a name to suggest, it should be something appealing and cool. Maybe we can go in that direction. And maybe that can be something similar to what we have seen now in the recovery plan. So investment plan from member states to be approved by the Commission. And in case, if the investment is judged as productive, maybe exempt from the debt to GDP rules. Or another option, which is perhaps slightly more likely, is the stronger involvement of the EU in the creation of public goods. So a fiscal capacity that's investing in European public goods, big infrastructure. Minister Giovannini mentioned on energy, security, health, and that is a boost to the EU budget with a very centralized planning. So more EU and less strategic determination of budget allocation at national level. A third one, which for me would be needed but politically very difficult, is a central stabilization capacity to really give to the European budget and to the European budgets, plural, of member states, a more counter-cyclical power that is not only there. So not only investment for the medium to long term, like the one we need for the climate and the digital transition, but also the ability to to respond immediately to shocks. And that is something that the US has been able to do, and we are not able to do in EU because we don't really have this counter-cyclical capacity that we've done Sure now. It was the only thing, but it's temporarily, it's already finished. Are we going to replicate it or not? So thanks a lot. I hope that this will kick off an interesting discussion with the fantastic speakers that are joining us today, and thank you all.
Thank you, David. Very interesting. I think that the interventions both by David and by the Minister have also taken us into a third area, which is if that fiscal capacity develops, what exactly are we going to be using it for? So all of that up for discussion with our panel, whom I'm going to invite to join us up here on the main dais. I'm going to move over here. So that I can introduce our panelists and fire questions at them from on high. Always helps to be able to dominate in these situations. Please, yeah. Strictly in alphabetical order, Francesca Bettio, Professor of Economics at the University of Siena, and also a member of the board of Monte Paschi Siena Bank. Gregorio de Felice, who is the chief economist of Italy's biggest bank by assets, Banca Intesa Sanpaolo. Veronica de Romanis, who teaches economics at the Luis University in Rome and is also my colleague in the faculty at Stanford's campus in Florence. And finally, and by no means least, Georgios Papakonstantinou, former finance minister of Greece, a man who has experienced all of this at the sharp end, and who now teaches at the European University Institute in Florence. Okay, now I'd like to start actually with a conversation that, I'm sorry, we have an extra panelist, and I didn't know anything about that. Ah, sorry. Yes, I remember that from that, but I didn't know because you weren't on the list in the program. My apologies. Perhaps that you could just grab the microphone briefly and introduce yourself so we all start off on the same footing.
I'm Roberto Castaldi. I'm Professor of Political Theory at Campus University and Director of CESUE, the Center for European Studies, which is a spin-off of Sant'Anna, and of Euractiv Italy.
Terrific. Okay, Roberto, yes, indeed. I remember that we were discussing all of this last week, but then you somehow sort of disappeared from the paperwork, so my apologies. Okay, I'd like to actually start with Francesca, just looking ahead at the uses of a fiscal capacity. And you made a very interesting point when we were having coffee on the terrace a couple of days ago, that which I'd like you to elaborate on, the distinction between the one-off payments and the ongoing possible cost of those payments, which sounded to me like as good a justification as you could get for having that permanent or continuous fiscal capacity.
Well, I would like, I'm a positive person. So now I'm going to elaborate on something that is a criticism of the next generation EU as it is being implemented in Italy, but a criticism that in a way we can use to argue for a permanent fiscal space. And what is this critical feature? Well, I mean, I'll start by saying, I think that everybody who follows the implementation of the recovery fund in Italy knows that some of the tenders are being, we say in Italian, deserted. That means there is no tenderer, right? The bids are not made. There are many reasons for that. I'll tell you one for a specific case that I know better, and that is the one of kindergartens. Now, the tenderers have disappeared, especially in the South. There are many reasons for that, we know. One is less capacity, less sort of human capital, if you want, skilled people to draft plan, etc., etc. And so less spending capacity. But the other is the fear of municipality that after the investment is made and the kindergarten physically is built, they'll have to sustain the cost, right? So you see that one of the problems with this, there are two connected problems, but one of the problems with a one-off investment, right, is that by its nature, because you need control, because it is one-off, for many reasons, you tend to consider investment just investment in physical infrastructure. But if you augment the physical infrastructure, you have to put people there. I mean, to put it bluntly, right? Which means current expenditure afterwards. Now, my feeling is that this proportionality between, physical and one fixed cost and running cost is difficult to sort out when you think of a major plan, huge investment in all sectors, and you simply invest or tend to invest in physical infrastructure. That relates to a point, and then I'll close mine, that what Professor Giovannini was saying, meaning that we need to change the accounts. Why? Because investment is just thought as investment in physical rather than investment in social infrastructure. For example, in the case of kindergartens, most of your running cost is teachers, right? That is current cost, okay? So, and that is crucial. Not only, there are other ways in which this change, this shift in thinking between investment just as physical infrastructure and investment as social infrastructure will sort of improve any attempt to react to shocks. The main message, however, is this. We need a permanent fiscal space if this balance between physical and social investment is going to be sort of respected and observed as it should.
Francesca, thank you very much. We're going to come on and develop those ideas later in the discussion, I'm sure. What I'd like to do is to bring us right back now to the present and to the rules that we have right now in the form of the Stability and Growth Pact. Rules that were the subject of an announcement by the Commission last week, which really raised the question of whether we do still have those rules. And at that point, I'd like to bring in Veronica to talk about, do we have a Stability and Growth Pact or not?
Thanks, John. So thank you so much for the invitation. So rules, as John said, has been suspended for another year. This is because we have, what is called the general escape clause, which says that when there is a recession in the whole area, you can suspend the rules. Question, is there a recession? No. According to the forecast of the European Commission, there is no such thing as a recession yet. We will see, I hope not. Well, the Commission said, okay, it's not a recession, but there's a lot of uncertainty. So that's the reason why we are extending the suspension of the rules. Then, second point, once we're going to have next year this suspension of the rules, can we still increase the debt and the deficit? Well, Dombrovskis said, not really. Well, the rules are suspended, but be careful, we might open an excessive deficit procedure, which means we're going to monitor what you're going to do with your public finance at the end of this year and next year. So let me tell you that this is not clear at all. And it's not a good idea not to be clear because you can fuel populism. The European Commission should explain what is going on. Okay, having said that, let's go back to the rules because what is clear is that the current rules will be reformed probably starting from next year. So my question here in my last 2 minutes is, do we really need to reform the rules? Short answer, I don't think so, and I'll explain you why. Okay, rules, people don't like the rules because they are too complex, they can be pro-cyclical, they do not give an incentive for, reducing the debt or reducing the investment. Is it really true? Is it the fault of the rules or is it the fault of the interpretation of the European Commission? You see again, interpretation, discretion, politics. Okay, first, they are pro-cyclical. So it means that when you are in a recession, if you really want to follow the rules, you have to reduce the debt. And in that case, you're going to worsen even more the recession. Is this really true? Let me remind you what happened in 2003 when the German Chancellor Schröder said, I am in a huge recession, unemployment is really high, Germany was the sick man of Europe, and he said, I'm not going to follow the rules, I'm not going to cut expenditures. The president of the European Commission, Mr. Romano Prodi, said, you have to cut expenditures. This is what is written in the rules. The president of the Council of Ministers, another Italian politician, Mr. Giulio Tremonti, said, no, well, if you read the rules, it is written that if you are in a severe recession, you can have more time in order to respect the rules. And that, you see, different interpretation. And actually, the Council of Ministers, the president of Council of Ministers was absolutely right. And Germany got 2 more years in order to implement the reforms, namely the Agenda 2010 that changed completely the German economy, and they succeeded in, achieving a zero deficit in the following 3 years. So this is a specific example on how interpretation matters. After the breach of Germany and France, a new indicator was introduced, the structural deficit. So if you, so because of the structural deficit, you take into account the cycle, which means that if you are in a recession, you don't have to cut expenditures. So this is my first point. Second point, I'll be very brief. How you measure the structural deficit, it's a problem because you need to estimate the impact of the cycle. You need to measure the output gap. Okay, this is a question of choosing the right method. I know it's complicated, but the reality is complex. There is some complexity. So, I mean, and you need, if you don't want to be procyclical, you need some estimate of the cycle. I mean, there's no other alternative. Third point, and then I conclude, the rules are too strict. Okay, let me remind you what Mario Draghi said in an interview at a Spanish newspaper, El País, in 2015, when he was the president of the ECB, and he was the one who invented the fiscal compact. He said, well, the rules have all the flexibility that we need. And what does it mean? It means that if you read the rules, you will see that the Commission gives a general assessment and takes into account lots of indicators in order to really take into account the complexity of each single member state. So you take into account the impact of the cycle. You take into account if you are in a severe economic recession. You take into account the net saving position of the private sector. You take into account primary, current, and capital account expenditures. If you are implementing reforms, in particular pension reforms, if, and this is very important because of what's going on with these last two shocks, if you are implementing policies in the context of a common growth strategy of the Union. So you see, it's a really general assessment, and you can tell your story, you can tell what you are planning to do. And this is exactly what Italy has done in the past. Italy knows very well what flexibility means, because during the Renzi government, Italy was able to get more than 40 billion euros of flexibility, which doesn't mean that the European Commission was giving Italy more money, but was giving Italy more time in order to respect its objectives when it comes to public finances. So having said that, I think that the rules need some sort of complexity, and it's a good thing that there is some sort of complexity. We need some sort of indicator of a cycle. And we need a sort of a process. One of the proposals, and this is really my last 30 seconds, one of the proposals is to have only one indicator. But this is not enough. This is really not enough. I think it will be a big mistake from a political point of view. It will be very complicated to explain to the European citizens that the assessment on your budget is only based on one single indicator because of the whole complexity. So the question, the point to me is that before reforming the rules, the European Commission should answer to the following question: why the Pact, how it is right now, is an obstacle to implementing reforms and making investments. Because since, as I said, if you want to implement reforms, if you want to finance investment, you can do it according to the following rules. Thank you.
Just very, very quickly, do you think that those rules need clarification? You've spoken several times about interpretation, etc.
Well, in 2015, the European Commission published guidelines, and the goal was exactly to clarify, to try to give a growth-friendly interpretation of the rules. I think the problem is discretion. This is absolutely true. There is a lot of politics in this sort of a negotiation, but I'm not convinced that if you reform and introduce only just few simple indicators, that will be better from an economic point of view and especially from a political point of view. Thank you.
Since we've raised issues both of economics and politics. First of all, to the Economist, to Gregorio, for his comments on what Veronica has been saying, and then go over to George for a political viewpoint on the same. Gregorio.
Okay, thank you, Francesco Grillo, for inviting me. Thank you for this brilliant organization. Can't you hear me? I guess this is a Romano Prodi's microphone, and there is a flow here. So, as he said that the Stability and Growth Pact was stupid, probably this is the retaliation of the micro. Can you hear better me now? Okay, a little. So one point on Veronica. Veronica, I believe that you are right in saying that the general escape clause probably is not justified that by the current economic environment. My feeling is that with the war, the priority of the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact is below in the ranking, and so as there is no consensus how to change the PSG, this is another reason why we, the Europeans, the Council has suspended it. I fully agree with you when you speak about a great degree of flexibility with the current rules, but we have also to take into account that current rules have some flaws, which have, in the sense that they haven't been able to, how can I say, to avoid the pro-cyclical fiscal policy, probably because the Commission wasn't severe enough to say member states, to tell member states when they were not sufficiently counter-cyclical. So we haven't avoided the counter-cyclical stance of fiscal policy. In good times, member states fail to build the buffer they need in downturns and so on. Second, as the budgetary tightening is performed at the wrong time, it's more damaging for growth and normally biased against capital spending. This is what we observed, for example, in Greece, in Spain, in Italy. In Italy, to face the sovereign debt crisis, we reduced strongly discretionary measures, and so capital spending dropped a little too much, and so this was a pro-cyclical effect. And at the end of the day, the rules failed to prevent the increase in the debt ratios in Italy, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, Greece, and so on. So what it seems now, according to the experts, and is that there is a wide consensus in favor of an expenditure rule with a debt anchor. The rule of debt in the stability growth probably is over, also because it hasn't been applied for years. But the expenditure rule seems on the top of the list. Let me conclude on the obsession for the flexibility. You mentioned that flexibility of fiscal rules. Generally speaking, it's good to have a flexibility, provided that it works both ways. In one sense and in the other. I cannot be flexible only when I want to increase, to have more funds, more money, and so on. I think that asking always, at any time, in any cyclical position for more spending and lower taxes, it's a good recipe for a disaster, not for the movie, but you know, it's a very difficult topic. And so to conclude, I think there is flexibility. There is something which is old, out of fashion is not the right word in English, but and the last point is that the fiscal rules are extremely important also for monetary policy. Do not forget that.
So, in a nutshell, you would say quite a substantial reform of those rules, or would you like to redraft?
I think it's impossible to rewrite or read because it means a change in the treaty. It requires the approval by the 27 parliaments and so on. So, but a fine-tuning of the current rules are necessary.
Giorgio.
First of all, also thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. So let's jazz it up a bit. I fundamentally disagree with Veronica. Okay, I think that the pact does not work, has never worked, and we don't need to ditch it, but we need to fundamentally rewrite it. Now we can talk about the politics in a moment, but okay. So does the pact make countries do the right thing in good times? It has not. Does it prevent us from catastrophic situations in bad times? No, it has not. Do countries pretty much follow the edicts of the pact? Average debt to GDP ratios in the Eurozone at the moment are 90%. The pact has a 60% rule. We're 50% above that. So, okay, we can keep suspending it and pretend that it's there because it's hard to reform it. Or we can go with economic logic, and economic logic, I think, suggests certain things. It does suggest that we need to reform it for simplification. I think it's clear, look, the idea of discretion in interpretation, I'm not against that. I think, but it needs to be anchored around something which is simple that everybody understands. The problem with structural deficits is that nobody understands how they're calculated, and therefore the kind of discretion that people have in interpreting around them is not really the kind of discretion that I would argue would be necessary. So we need a simple expenditure rule. I think that that's quite clear. We need to revisit the debt rule. Look, if Klaus Regling comes out and says, let's think about 100% debt to GDP ratio, I'm not saying we should go there. But I'm saying that we need to reflect on whether keeping the 60% to GDP ratio makes sense in an environment where, in addition to having spent, rightly so, in the middle of the pandemic, we have huge transitions in front of us that will require incredible amounts of spending. How are you going to do the climate transition and the digital transition without some fiscal expenditures that need to come from somewhere? So, and economics has learned in the last couple of sort of decades that our original ideas about what is and what is not sustainable need to be revisited. Now, having said that, do I argue that we don't need a rule? Absolutely not. Do I, is it true that some countries require to tighten anyway? Yes, they do. Mine is one of them. If you have a debt to GDP ratio of 200 something percent, you need to do something about it. Is Italy one of them? I'm afraid so. So I think there's two fundamental questions, and I'll close with that. The first one is, how much political space is there for a clever tweaking of the Stability and Growth Pact that maintains its anchoring elements, because we do need rules in a monetary union. There's no question about it. So that's the first question. And there, the economist in me argues for certain things, and the former politician in me says that the room is less than we thought. So there's a real question of how far you can go. And the second is that while I do argue that we need reform of the pact, on balance, it's not our most important problem. I think that it is much more important to talk about how we generate the kind of fiscal capacity for medium-term investments with an EU anchor, not at the national level. So the European public goods that David was showing before, in the middle of the three brackets, and how we can build on the Next Generation EU for something which is more permanent, rather than spending too much time on the minutiae of the pact. I'll stop.
Point taken. And we will move on very soon to talking about the fiscal capacity, but not before I've given Roberto a chance to comment on the foregoing. So far, we have had clarification from Veronica, but ma non troppo. We've had reform, but not a total rewrite from Gregorio, and we've had major rewrite from Georgios. So as you can see, Francesca, we are moving steadily towards unanimity. Just to complete the picture, Roberto.
I'll start from the last point, which I think is the right one. If we have EU investment, we can keep the Stability and Growth Pact almost as it is. Because if the investment we need to have growth is provided at European level, there is no need to do more deficit at national level. If you only have to cover current expenditure at the national level because investment is covered by the EU, then it can work. And this was a Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa dictum: austerity to the state, but growth to Europe. If Europe is able to provide growth, then the debt will be reduced because there is growth and member state can do without too much deficit. But this brings me to the other point. We have to keep this discussion together, not separate, because the way we create the fiscal capacity must have an impact on the way we design the rule of the Stability and Growth Pact. That's why it's more important, as Gregorio said, to start from the fiscal capacity. And I think we need to discuss how to do it. And I think the most important thing to change in the SGP is the time of the debt ratio reduction, because this is unsustainable now that the national debt has increased because of the pandemic. And this is not in the treaty, this is in secondary legislation, so it can be done much more easily. And this is the most important thing we need to change in the SGP. Regarding the fiscal capacity, what we must focus is not just the capacity, the borrowing capacity for the EU, which was created with the NGU, but the fiscal capacity, the own resources. That's the crucial point. And that's what we haven't managed yet to do. There is an agreement, but this has not been implemented. And we may risk that the next generation EU will have to be paid back by the member states if we don't create their own resources. So this is the real political battle. This is the issue, because if we have our own resources that can sustain also a borrowing capacity, then we can have the European public goods that David was mentioning. And also this will change the nature of NGU, because now NGU anyway is based on a decision by the member states. If we have a fiscal capacity that can finance the public goods, the next NGU that basically are conditional grants, essentially, will be different. Because first, we will be able to spend money also on pan-European project. NGU does not have pan-European project because in the Commission proposal, there were 12% of the money for pan-European project and the member state took it out. If the money comes from the EU budget, this will not happen. And this is crucial for the interaction, the dependence of European economy. Second, there will be more leverage in the Commission in the discussion with the member states. So it will become more of a similar to a conditional grant in the US than it was now, where you have this broad category, 20% for green, 12% for digital, and so on and so forth. But then everybody spends money in not a synergic way. And this will also help turning the Commission into the embryo of a federal government that Giovannini was referring to. I would also like to mention two things, that we can do all of this without treaty change. This is crucial. If we go back to the January 2019 Commission Juncker communication about towards a more efficient and democratic decision-making in EU tax policy, there was a proposal for a gradual phase-in of QMB on fiscal policy that could bring up to 600 billion revenue for the EU compared to what we are doing now through tax harmonization on resources and so on. That would be key. And the final point is we should use the experience of the Juncker plan, the European Fund for Strategic Investment, on three aspects. First, there we introduce the golden rule at European level. I think it's important we don't go for golden rule at national level. We should not say, okay, you can spend on green or on defense or on digital at national level and this is taken out of the deficit. Because this will create a huge trust problem among member states, because everything will go in this category in certain countries. All current expenditure will become green, digital, and defense. And there would be a problem of trust among member states. Second, this would not create European public goods, a European defense, a European energy policy, and so on. So we need to have the European golden rule. If there are national contributions to the European Defense Fund, the European Peace Facility, the next generation U.2 or whatever we want to call it, that is taken out of the calculation, because these are money that we pull together and we decide together how to spend them. If we do that, we don't have the trust problem, because everybody is in charge of the money pot and how to spend it. And in this way, we strengthen the fiscal capacity and the spending capacity of the union. The second important element of EFSI we should think for the next generation is a stronger centralized management. Nowadays, we have a problem. We see it with structural funds, but we are going to see it with next generation as well. Strong member states that have a good implementing capacity are able to spend well the funds. So there is convergence. The weakest one, that are the one that need it most, have also the weakest capacity to spend the money, and this doesn't bring convergence. Italy was the second largest beneficiary of the Juncker plan, because it was managed by the European Investment Bank, while it doesn't manage to spend the structural funds, because the South doesn't have the managerial capacity. So we need more centralized management and less decentralized management for this to work. And the EFSI was a good example. And the third good example of EFSI we should think also for the second next generation EU possibly is public-private partnership. We don't need only public investment, but public investment that is able to be a catalyst for private investment if we want to have a transformative impact. So we can work on what we have, on some good experience we have to think about the next generation EU, but knowing that the crucial point is the fiscal capacity. And we have there another example that is the first community, European Coal and Steel Community, because the European Coal and Steel Community had two powers. It had borrowing powers and it had fiscal powers. So what we are asking is to give the union the powers that the first community had, and we took it out with the 1957 Rome Treaty. And this is an important issue. And the very final point is, whatever we will try to do this probably with the treaty change, the treaty reform after the conference and so on. But we must be aware that this can be done without treaty change, and that if we don't manage to do it 27, we need to go for the euro area. There was a long discussion about completing the EMU. All what we are talking is about completing the EMU. If we go to the 2017 communication by the Commission about completing the EMU, we find all the detail of how to do it. So don't waste the work that was done in a different environment, but now we have the chance to do it.
Thank you very much indeed, Roberto. I've been aware that Veronica has been itching to get back into the debate with some replies to one or two of the points that have been made. So if you could do so briefly, and then I'd like to move on to the issue of what we do with this fiscal space if we can develop it.
Yeah, thank you. Three quick points. Interpretation of the EU and member states. One example of interpretation. In 2014, you can see that if you Google it and you take the economic and financial document of the Italian government, you will see that the finance minister back then, Mr. Paduan, was asking for flexibility in order to implement some reforms. There is a table, you find a table. And the European Commission said, no, we will not give you any kind of flexibility. Actually, you have to make some corrections on your deficit. A year later, the European Commission published the guidelines. Without changing the rules, but only, explaining how to use the rules in a more growth-friendly way. The same Minister of Finance, the same Italian Minister of Finance, presented the exactly same table with exactly the same reforms. You can check it if you read the documents. And then the European Commission said, okay, we will give you the flexibility. So you see, it's really, it's really a question how you interpreted the rules. Then it's another story. If the member states do not implement reforms and do not spend on investments, and they prefer to spend on current expenditures, one perfect example is the 80 €80. This is a measure for, reducing income taxes. This is a national choice, which has nothing to do with the rules. One last point of Gregorio, which I think is crucial, is the link between rules, fiscal rules, and monetary policy. rules have been suspended. So also next year, countries can increase the debt and the deficit. So my question, and this I'm very curious to know what you think. So what will be the reaction of the ECB? ECB has some tools in order to, help countries which are, in a very unstable financial situation. Namely, the security market program is one of the tool in the toolbox of the ECB. In 2011, during the financial crisis, the ECB used the S&P on several countries: Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and also Italy. Remember the letter from the ECB signed by Jean-Claude Trichet and Mario Draghi. But that was possible because some countries were under an adjustment program in the Troika, etc. But Italy was under an excessive deficit procedure. There was an assessment on the sustainability of the debt. So what will happen now without rules in case of, high instability on a specific country? Do you think the ECB can still activate these kind of programs? I'm quite skeptical, so that's why I think having suspended the rules for another year with very high debt countries that have increased in the last 2 years might not be the right decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. I'd like now to move on to the, if you like, the big picture. If we can develop this fiscal capacity, what do we want to do with it? Now, let me put that question first of all to Gregorio.
Well, in a very short way, I think that we need to increase fiscal capacity essentially for two reasons. The first one is macroeconomic stabilization. The point is that there is a lot of enthusiasm, but at the end of the day, look at example at the Mesenberg Declaration between France and Germany. They were okay, they agreed on that, but the bottom line was that Germany and France disagreed on the size. Tens of billions for Germany, hundreds of billions for France. And I think we need a budget of significant size, but many governments resisted to relinquish their significant resources or their firepower and prefer let others decide how to fight a downturn. Germany has only supported some degree of fiscal union during crisis times, but it has quickly reverted to its usual preference for minimal fiscal integration in normal times. I think that a reasonable candidate for something in this field can theoretically be something regarding subsidies for unemployed people. But be careful, because if it becomes a permanent transfer union from a low unemployment rate country to high unemployment rate country in a permanent way, that we cannot work for a long, because it is a transfer union. And when you speak with Germany, they say, we do not want a transfer union. So can be a permanent support, such as SURE, for example, but not permanent. The other point for having fiscal capacity is what Roberto was saying, and also Georgios' pronunciation, my Greek pronunciation is terrible, I'm sorry. And I think that at the end of the day, we are less distant than it looked before, because Europe, member states have similar challenges: aging of population, the greening, the digitalization, and now the energy policy, the defense policy. So is it right leaving all of these topics to the single member states, or having a higher European budget and working together at least partially common projects and national projects together, also to give a sense to youth, to the younger generation, that Europe is not only Erasmus, for example, but there is something.
I was very struck, in fact, in Annalisa Pires's movie, the young Catalan at the beginning, who says that, you know, the EU seems to be many things, but it doesn't seem to be a social union in any way. And that actually gives me a good cue to bring back Francesca. Gregorio talked about perhaps subsidies for the unemployed. You're a labor economist. What is your view of what this fiscal capacity might be able to achieve?
First, I take the opportunity to come back what I said at the beginning, because I think that there is some misunderstanding when we talk about the distinction between current expenditure and fixed expenditure, the one that I brought in, and the distinction between investment in physical capital and investment in human capital. Now, what's happening very often is that current expenditure is what you spend on actually developing human capital. And that is not taking into account in national accounts. And my point before was that missing this point is also, may also be problematic for countries to account for their own debt. Because if you invest a lot in physical capacity, and then you classify as current expenditure what you have to invest to fill it with at least some human capital, then it means that maybe you have given ways to countries to increase their debt rather than reducing it, unless you really, balance the thing and you take that into account. So that is what I wanted to make clear, just in case it wasn't at the beginning. Concerning the labor market, well, I must say that when I looked at the program of the conference, I thought something is missing, because there was no point in which the transformation of Europe also concerned what is a key issue, that is labor market, right? And what is the key issue? Now, concerning shocks, yes, we have programs like SURE, right, that are meant to be automatic stabilizer with respect to the labor market. But there are other things that are more fundamental to actually prevent shocks, right? Fiscal capacity should be able to also counter in advance, right? Now, one of the main issues in Europe is the, divergence in salaries and pay across countries, with obviously, rightly so, perfect mobility between countries. Now, this is not exactly, this is good, but it also poses problems, right? And the same problem exists vis-a-vis the migrants. And I just want to touch on the point that I'm really interested in. If you want to redraft Europe, rethink of Europe, I also think you have to think of the labor market, and you have to think of at least extending the provision for the legal minimum wage. Now, the Commission, as you know, and the Council have been very timid in that respect. And in fact, they're going backward, if anything, right? Although they write a lot and you find many discussion about that. But there is, they're really timid in that respect. And part of the reason is that a labor policy is national policy. You have to change the treaty, et cetera, et cetera. Apparently, this is not completely true. So I don't think that changing the treaty is really necessary in this respect. But having a legal minimum wage at federal level, because many countries already have it, at federal level, can have at least two positive effects with respect to shocks and what we are talking about. One is that it's one way in which to sort of push countries to converge, right? So it is, in a way, an encouragement to convergence. And the other way is that it can be an automatic stabilizer for shocks, if properly devised and properly used. So that's the plea I wanted to make. If we are thinking about reforming Europe, I think a reform of the legal minimum wage at federal level should be there.
Thank you very much indeed, Francesca. I'm going to leapfrog George right now because I want to bring you in at the end to talk about what is politically possible of all of this wish list. So I'm going to go briefly, if I may, to Roberto for any comments on what has been said so far on how we use this fiscal capacity.
I would like to make a comment on a political point that Gregorio raised, Germany position. I think we need to understand that the fiscal capacity issue will go together the defense issue, because the decision by Germany to increase the military spending by 100 billion euro is creating a huge push for European defense. Like Prodi said on Friday, otherwise we'll create an industrial military complex in Germany that will never be dismantled. At the same time, to go for defense and fiscal policy, for Germany to accept that, so they are putting their money for the European defense and they are accepting to have the fiscal capacity. This won't happen unless France makes a plan to Europeanize the French seat at the UN and the force de frappe. Because just like the monetary union was the Europeanization of the Deutschmark, the European defense is the Europeanization of the force de frappe, ultimately. So if this is not on the table, we are not going to get a real fiscal capacity of the magnitude we need. And it's enough to go back to the McDougall report to have a fully fledged economic and monetary union where you need a 5% GDP budget. And if we add what we have between the European budget, the NGU, and the European Stability Mechanism, we have about a 7%, because 5% theoretically in the ESM and 2% between the budget and the Next Generation EU. So we are back to where we knew we would have to go. But we won't go any further unless there is this availability by France to Europeanize what they have to Europeanize to federalize Europe.
Super, thank you very much, Roberto, because that actually allows us to segue perfectly into inviting George to say, what of all of this wish list is possible? I mean, how do you convince the frugals? What is a strategy for convincing the frugals to accept some of the ideas that have been put on the table here?
You're putting the bar very high for me, so I will clearly go under it. So let me make a few comments to tie a few things together. When we're talking about a central fiscal capacity, as Gregorio said, there are two elements: the stabilization element and this sort of longer-term investment. I think of the two, the stabilization element is perhaps the least important. And the one that we could partly satisfy by focusing on labor market outcomes and leave it at that, because I think that going beyond that would be very, very hard. So sort of a beefed up, sure kind of thing, if we could get that on a more permanent basis and stay there. I think the more interesting and important is the one that facilitates medium-term investments. And there we're in the middle of European public goods territory. We recently did a small paper with Marco Butti trying to sort of think of European public goods in two dimensions, because there's a financing dimension, there's a delivery dimension. So you have pure European public goods where you both finance and deliver centrally, but you can also finance centrally and deliver nationally, finance nationally, deliver centrally, even finance and deliver nationally, as we're doing with batteries, for example, but they're connected to a project of great European interest. So, but it's clear that these are suboptimal compared to the finance and delivery centrally. So we need to move more resources there. So how do we do that? And I come back to Roberto's point. And this is that the missing element in the discussion is the revenues at European level. We've started a discussion, which is a very timid discussion. It goes around 2 or 3 potential tools that, if you add them all together, the tax on plastics, just don't come anywhere near what we need. So we need to crank up that discussion. Now, interestingly enough, there's some empirical evidence from YouGov polling and others that show that European citizens, especially following COVID, are more open to sort of resources at the European level spent on European priorities than they are in national transfers. So if you ask them, should Germany give money to, Greece, just take one example, they would be rather
Just
negative.
one example that happens.
Perchance, right. If you ask them, should we have more resources at the European level through some kind of European taxation, through carbon markets, through digital tax, through EU-wide company tax that is collected, they are more open to that. So there seems to be, okay, I mean, this is tentative evidence, some kind of political space that we can push. Now, what is the possibility of getting a deal? Again, I come back to something that Roberta said before, which is that it's got to be a bigger, we always come back to how do you manage to get big deals on the table? Well, you need to find the right political moment. Is this the right political moment? Perhaps. You've got the re-election of Macron in France. You've got a clear need following the war in Ukraine for some additional response. And you need a grand bargain. Okay. And the grand bargain needs to go beyond the pure economic elements and involve some of the political elements around the force de frappe, etc., which may be hard to get. So I'm not sure where that political space is, but I think that's the only way. You need to explain why things at the European level may work better. So there's a threshold issue here. You have to identify and show the externalities. So the economists need to do a lot of work, but then when it comes down, you need to define the perimeters of an agreement that would give something to everyone. And I am heartened by the fact that there was a big change in Germany in COVID, of course, to push for next generation EU. Can we push further with that? Well, it's certainly a more propitious sort of environment than it was during the Eurozone crisis to be able to get some push.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to actually pick up very, very briefly on two of those points that you've just made. One of them talking about own resources and carbon tax. And in an earlier session, we heard that gigantic amounts of money are going to be required and that maybe there's a link up there that could be made. The other point that you made about that maybe this not being the worst moment ties in with the fact that we may have seen a peaking of the populist wave in Europe. I'm sure there are going to be questions. I know there are questions, starting with my colleague from The Economist, Jan.
Okay.
So I really enjoyed the chart that David showed earlier, comparing America and the EU and expenditure at the sort of federal level in America versus the European level in Europe. Obviously, the problem is that overall taxation in Europe is already quite high. So if you start raising taxes at the European level, you might need to cut them at the national level. And governments will be very unwilling, presumably, to do that for a variety of reasons. So it's, so the question is it politically plausible to raise a substantial amount of tax at the European level without raising the overall taxation, which in Europe is already quite high? And the second sort of related question, which The Economist has long been in favor of a carbon tax. We think it's a great idea. For redistributional purposes, one way to alleviate the pain that it might cause the people who are cut, who are hurt most, the poor, is to actually do a tax and dividend type of system, which actually just recycles the money back to people while also introducing the incentives to lower carbon emissions. But that doesn't actually add to the whole pot, because it just comes in one way and goes out the other. And another problem with a carbon tax as a revenue raising tool is obviously that if it works, the revenues will come down in time because presumably carbon emissions will be falling, because that's the whole point. So, so basically the question is about the viability of raising enough money, either through a carbon tax, which again, in principle, great idea, or through some other means at the European level, at a high enough rate to be meaningful. Is that politically plausible?
Let's take the questions one by one so we don't get an accumulation. I'm going to put that, both those sides of that question, in fact, to George, because I think you're the man to talk about what is politically viable and what is not.
Well, I wouldn't argue that the carbon tax is of course, silver bullet in and of itself. It would have to be a combination of different types. You make a very good point, which is that the total would have to go up. There's got to be some redistribution from the national to the EU level. That won't be easy. But there's also, I mean, there's been windfall gains during COVID, especially in the digital sector. These are not necessarily always EU companies. They're also US companies. There's a wealth tax, which is something that we need to be seriously talking about. And you can put together a package which is politically doable and which even lightens a little bit the overall tax burden in some at the national level at the lower end. Obviously, I think this is actually easier to do in the US than it is in the EU because the US has mismanaged its response, its economic response to COVID, and we can see this in the inflation impact now, right? I mean, we are looking and comparing and saying, oh, at the federal level they did so much, but a lot of it was not very effective, right? So, and it's now showing up. We did it much more intelligently, but how to craft this kind of you're right. You're making the right. You're asking the right question, and I'm not sure I have the right answer either.
Last thing, I think you raise a very interesting point. At some point, you should have to reduce your taxes. So that really depends on what you can do and you want to do on the expenditure side. So that's why it's so important, the fiscal space that you have. And this explains why rules have been suspended. But the idea is to make a selection on what kind of expenditures you can increase in the next year. So you should concentrate on, as Professor Bettio said, on capital expenditures rather than current expenditures. And obviously, countries with high debt countries have a much more limited fiscal space. That will be a problem in reducing taxes and reducing expenditures.
Thank you for this conference. I may be a bit bleak. I am French. But it seems to me, and I would like to give you an idea of the debate in France on economics right now very quickly. What we feel is that it's going to be more about managing contraction and managing recession in the next decades than managing growth. We're seeing the end of cheap oil and gas. We have to spend on defense. We have the climate impact that will impact us greatly because the IPCC is saying that the Med region is going to be the most impacted of all on the planet. And so my question to all of you is, do you think the EU is the best venue to deal with this crisis? Do you think that the EU has enough legitimacy, has enough popular support to deal with managing contraction and sharing the sacrifice that we will have to make in the coming decades? Thank you.
Yeah, I am. Next time we will have more French people. That's one of the. Yeah. No, but let me elaborate the point that Jan was just making. Also starting from the very chart that David was showing on comparison between USA and EU, and well, it is quite clear that the comparability is not so